Welcome back. This is part B of the lecture on popular views of higher education costs. This time we'll be talking about student loans and bursting bubbles. Last time I showed you the financial aid debt clock that increases by $3,000 a second, roughly, and is well over $1.5 trillion. As I said in the last lecture, that is really driving up angst among a number of people across the country. It's really been driving up angst since the housing bubble of the collapse of 2008. The whole notion of a bursting bubble became part of people's conscious awareness, and they took the idea that the federal housing bubble, not the federal housing bubble, but the housing mortgage bubble, when it burst, if a similar thing happened with higher education, what would happen? So it created a kind of general fear in the population. So here's where it's coming from. From 1976 to 2010, the prices of all commodities rose 280%. The price of homes rose 400%. Private education rose 1,000%. In the end, the writer wrote, this bubble, this higher education bubble, will be worse than the last. Now, I hope that you've engaged your critical thinking and you're thinking about, okay, what exactly grew by 1,000%? Was that the list price, the net price? What was it that grew? And in what ways is the housing bubble similar to and different from the, quote, bubble in higher education student loan debt? Popular press got a hold of that idea, and it, for a few years, between 2012 and 2016, if you Googled higher education bubble, you'd find it all over the place. It's died down a little bit, but the notion that the student loan debt is a pustule ready to burst has not died down. There's still angst about that. An economic bubble needs to be defined and understood. An economic bubble is an increase in the cost of something. It's an asset that's not justified on the basis of rational analysis, especially the law of supply and demand. When I was a kid, and this dates me, there was this thing called the CB radio craze. CB stood for Citizens Band radios. This was before cell phones existed. People would put them in their cars, and it became this gigantic fad. So it was like one summer, people went from nobody had a CB radio or even knew what they were about to, by the end of that summer, everybody had this weird antenna on the top of their car, and they had this CB radio in their car, which was a little box with a handheld microphone, kind of like what police officers have in their patrol cars. The price of CB radios exploded. They went from, I don't know what they were, say $75 to $500 because everybody wanted a CB radio, right? There was this incredible demand very quickly that drove up the costs, and the price went up and up and up and up and up and up. Everybody had them, and then 2 months later, nobody cared. Meanwhile, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of, or thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of CB radios in stores, and the price totally collapsed, right? It became a non-thing after a couple of months. It was the great CB radio bubble burst of 1974. I made up the year. I don't remember what year it was, but I was a kid, and we got a CB radio, and we used it about 3 times. Bagehot, from 1856, wrote, I like this quote, "One thing is certain, that at particular times a great deal of stupid people have a great deal of stupid money, like to invest in CB radios, or homes that they can't possibly afford." And the question really is higher education like investing in a home that you can't really afford? How do you create a bubble? Well, there is an economic theory that tries to explain that, And it goes like this. Something of value gets noticed or promoted, like a CB radio or the value of owning a home. More money, especially credit, becomes available for that thing. And the credit part is really important. So the CB radio deal gets tossed off the table right now. But think about homes that you can't afford. A friend of mine moved to California, and she wanted to buy a house. Houses were extremely expensive in the LA area, and she went to look at this house because there was a for sale sign in front of it. She walked in. She loved the house. She knew she couldn't possibly afford it. Turns out the owner was a banker, and the banker said, well, have you thought about an interest-only loan? So you don't actually have to pay back the value of the house because home prices in California, they just go up and up and up and up, right? So don't take out a loan where you're going to have to pay back the capital, the actual loan amount. Take out a loan where all you do on a monthly basis is pay interest and then rely on the fact that housing prices are going to go up and eventually you're going to sell the house and you'll make a profit, right? She bought the house. And actually in this situation, it ends happily. Her income went way up. She was able to pay down the note. But in many cases, that's not what happened. So credit became easily available. And people felt really good about it because for a period of time, demand for homes caused home prices to rise quickly, just like the banker in California said. We'll talk about San Francisco because I have data on that coming up. But lots of people in San Francisco want houses, right? Housing prices have gone up incredibly quickly and incredibly high in the San Francisco area. But what happens over time is that prices can't continue to go up on a house or anything else indefinitely. The inflated prices become unsustainable. Really, there aren't a lot of people in San Francisco that can afford a 3-bedroom starter home that's 1,200 square feet that costs $750,000. If that's true, if there aren't a lot of people that can afford it, then demand falls and prices drop. They drop slowly at first, but at some point, usually because of some particular event, panic ensues and people start to sell quickly. And all of a sudden, the value of a home, the value of a CB radio, the value of whatever it is, drops so fast that many people go bankrupt. And that's exactly what happened in San Francisco. So if you look at this graph that plots the home value across time, starting in 1980, home prices went up pretty slowly, but you hit about 1998 and home prices in San Francisco started to escalate very, very quickly. And for the decade between 1998 and 2008, that steep increase in the cost of a home in San Francisco was a function of demand. But in just before 2008, there were some factors that really impacted people's ability to buy homes. And all of a sudden, when the Great Recession hit, the home values in San Francisco took a very steep dive. Now, the reality is that they've come way back and that they're now even higher than they were. But that shows you the burst of the bubble. That graph on this slide of San Francisco Home Price Index shows you the tremendous increase in demand, followed by some event. The event's not shown, but we know it's the housing collapse or the financial collapse of 2008, followed by the decline in home values, which left a lot of people with their home values substantially lower than their loan amounts, which in some cases caused people to declare bankruptcy. Now, are we creating a higher education bubble? Let's take a look at it. It's the case that something of value has gotten noticed or promoted in recent years. For at least a period of time after the recession, the value of higher education was noticed. And, people were upset about the price, but they also believed that what higher education bought you was really of value. There were all kinds of demonstrating the value of higher education. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics from 2007. Well, it's data from 2016, the latest available data I could get. It was published actually in February of 2018. And it has two parts to it. It shows the unemployment rate and it shows median usual weekly earnings. So if you multiply the weekly earnings by 52, that gives you roughly the annual income. You'll see doctoral and professional degree holders earn substantially more than master's degree holders, who earn substantially more than bachelor's degree holders, who earn substantially more than people in other categories. And you can also see the associated unemployment rates. The value of higher education is clearly demonstrated through Bureau of Labor Statistics data. And people grab a hold of that. Certainly, I've promoted that as I've given talks to parents. I know that institutions are always trying to push the value of a degree, and data like this is extremely helpful because it comes from an objective source, the government, and it unambiguously, or at least arguably, demonstrates that more education does lead to greater wealth, at least over time. And on a weekly basis, it's very clear you get paid more. So that view that going to college and getting a degree will be stuffing money into yourself is a fairly popular view, even though in recent years there's been more negativity attached to higher education as a whole. I don't believe there's any question that people believe that higher education leads to higher income or lower unemployment. You can argue with the methodology of gathering the data, but over and over and over it's demonstrated that more education is of value economically. What that shows is that there is this movement towards people wanting a degree because people want this thing that we provide. Are we creating a higher ed bubble? Well, we know that the first step is accurate. That is, something of value gets noticed or promoted. Higher education has been noticed to lead to higher wealth, and that therefore makes it something that's in demand. Second, we know that more money, especially credit, is becoming available for higher education. This was particularly true in the Obama era, particularly true after 2009. Pell Grant funding went way up. Student loan availability became greater. Parent Plus loans, no borrowing limits. People took out more and more loans. And so there was more credit. We know, however, that in recent years, that's not the case, that there are fewer borrowers now. But in the 9 years between 2004 and 2014, total student debt went way up, 250% increase, even in inflation-adjusted dollars. We know that debt per person increased greatly by 35% in inflation-adjusted dollars, and the percentage of student loan holders who are adults increased almost by a factor of 2, 86%. And that all that data comes from the College Board. So yes, there was more credit available, and there was that 10-year period from 04 to 13 where student debt grew dramatically, not just in total dollars, but in dollars spread across people. We also know that credit was extended to bad students, right? It's kind of like extending credit to people who have poor credit records. If you give a loan to a really bad student, that's not necessarily a wise investment. The government has chosen, thankfully, to not get in the business of evaluating the creditworthiness of students. If they're in college, and we've admitted them, they trust colleges and universities to determine whether they should be students. And because we've determined that they can be students, they will give loans. It's really an amazing system of trust from the federal government when you think about it. But on the other hand, it's the case that we don't always know who's going to be a great student, and some of our students are really not good, and they get Fs and they get dismissed. If they take on loans, they're going to get saddled with debt, no degree, and they're much more likely to default on their loans. Now, we also know that students who hold loans are more likely to drop out than those without loans. There's a substantial body of data that shows that borrowing is an indicator of risk, and high-risk students drop out at higher rates. Students who drop out are way more likely to default on their loans. Here's one study. There's lots of studies, but from this study from 2012 demonstrates that, in fact, people who either drop out or are kicked out are much more likely to default. Well, does demand exceed supply, and is that causing prices to rise quickly? We know that prices are rising, right? But student demand is probably not what's driving up price increases. It's probably a combination of Bowen's revenue theory about striving for excellence that's driving up cost, and I also am a strong believer that cost disease is driving up costs. It's not demand. It's these other factors that are more outside our, in some ways in our control and in other ways outside of our control. So there is some evidence that there's a higher education bubble, and it is probably related to increased perceived value of college. It may be related to the widespread availability of credit, and that credit, at least at times, gets extended to poor students, which I've equated to people with poor credit ratings. And we also know that there has been an increased cost of higher education. Now, you should be thinking critically and saying, all right, but in what ways is higher education debt different from mortgage debt? In what ways is it different from credit card debt? In what ways is it different from used car debt that you might, if you took out a loan to buy a car? So engage your critical thinking and ask, all right, there are some similarities, but there are certainly some differences. Are the inflated prices of higher education unsustainable? Yeah, maybe. Art and Science Group is a consulting group that is usually a consultant to elites. They've consulted with University of Chicago and other sort of name schools. And their consultants wrote that while optimists may see light at the end of the economic recovery tunnel, findings continue to paint a bleak picture about college affordability and the willingness of families to try to pay for college in the face of difficult circumstances. In short, college affordability remains a profound challenge for a majority of students and their families. Right, college is expensive, we get it. The rate of increase in tuition increases is unsustainable. But remember that the value of a college degree is not equated with tuition. So the cost of college is really unrelated to value, or at least loosely related to value. It's not like a home, right? The home mortgage is most definitely tied to the home value. If the value of a home goes up, you can sell that home and pay off your mortgage. Can you ever sell your college education, right? The holder of a degree can't sell that degree. And so we're trying to equate here a housing bubble with a higher education bubble when it's not comparable, because you can't sell that which you borrowed for in higher education, whereas you can sell that which you borrowed for when you bought a house. They're not the same thing. So to try to say that there's a higher education bubble because all the loans being taken out might collapse is a questionable comparison. If we look at enrollments, we see that enrollments really did go up enormously. The blue line in this is the bubble ready to burst graph, shows total post-secondary enrollment. That's total enrollment in 2-year schools, 4-year schools, and any professional school, like even a haircutting school. You can see that there was tremendous increase in enrollments in colleges and universities between 1955 and 2005. And it's flattened out, leveled off since 2005. The percentage of high school students is in the yellow line. That's the percentage of high school graduates graduated in the last couple of years who've enrolled in colleges and universities. You can see that's gone up also, but it's flattened out pretty well after 2005. So there's not tremendous crash of demand for higher education, but it's also not going up faster. As demand falls, we can expect tuition prices to drop, but we should not expect that the value of higher education has declined. The value of the product is the degree. Tuition just gets you at the value of that product, and it's not. Tuition prices may level off, but the value of the degree continues to go up because people who hold bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees are being paid more than people who are high school graduates. Continuing with this analysis, the theory of bursting bubbles is that at some point a panic may ensue, triggering risky behavior and a precipitous price collapse as people sell or go bankrupt. Well, we seem to be nowhere near a collapse of the value of college degrees, right? In fact, what we've seen over recent years is that even jobs that used to go to people who hold high school degrees and could be done by people who hold high school degrees are now being given preferentially to people who hold bachelor's degrees. The value of college degrees is nowhere near collapsing, and in fact, arguably, the opposite is happening. They're going up as our culture and our society places greater emphasis on a skilled workforce. If there is a collapse, the collapse is going to be an economic collapse for people who can't pay back the student loans, but it's not going to be a collapse in the value of that which they have earned, their degree. Student loan default rate 11.5%. Most recently, data from the Department of Ed. Mortgage delinquency was 6.9% when it hit its peak during the Great Recession. So there's a greater default rate now among student loans than there was with home mortgages, but there's not a collapse yet, an economic problem. The outstanding student loans, we know 1.5 trillion, 1.6 trillion, it's gone up. Mortgage amounts in 2010 during the Great Recession, 14.3 trillion. So that's a very big difference in the economic impact of a home mortgage collapse versus people defaulting on student loans. So the default amount for people who are defaulting on student loans has 1/6 the impact of the default from people who are defaulting on home mortgages. The impact is just much smaller. So even though there's a lot of student loan debt out there, and even though the default rate on student loan debt is pretty high, it's still 1/6 the debt that was viewed or seen by society during the Great Recession. Again, I know I've hit this point several times, but I'll hit it again. The earning value of education is not declining. People with student loan debt have greater capacity to earn unless they've dropped out of school. We see, if we zero in on millennials, that among millennials, people holding bachelor's degrees are paid much more highly, that their employment rate is much lower than those not having four-year degrees, that they're much less likely to live in poverty. The value of a higher education degree is clear in our society. There's just tremendous data to show that earning a college degree is economically beneficial. Now, economics are just one aspect of the benefit of a degree, arguably, but it's an important aspect. And it also suggests that people who go into debt to get that degree, so long as they do get that degree, are not at risk of defaulting at high rates. Most of the default comes from people who drop out. Most of the default comes from people who weren't good students. If we could figure out how to get loans to the best students and not to the worst students, to students who are serious and not likely to drop out, the world would be a better place. But it's not easy to predict in ways that are not discriminatory. It's not easy to predict in ways that are accurate. And therefore, our approach to giving loans to all who are admitted is a reasonable way forward. It is unfortunate and really hard on those people who don't get their degrees, and we've enabled that. If we could fix that problem, we would go a long ways to fixing the problem of having an 11.5% default rate. So there are some similarities between factors that create economic bubbles and higher education. Certainly the increased value of higher education is a similarity. We've seen the value of higher education go up. We've seen lots of credit become available to students. We've started to witness a decline in enrollments due to high cost. But there are important differences. First of all, student loan debt is way lower than housing debt when the housing collapse happened. The federal government, not banks, holds the majority of the loans. They require students to pay those loans back. You can't discharge them if you go bankrupt. The degrees create tremendous earning power, and so significant default amounts are unlikely. It's not likely to be the same scope of problem that we saw during the Great Economic Recession. There are risk factors. It's a problem that we loan to people who drop out of college. It's a problem that we loan to students in programs that don't prepare students for higher earnings. I know of a elementary ed undergraduate who borrowed $160,000. She's single. She's going into elementary education, and her starting salary is likely to be $45,000. There's almost no chance that she's going to be able to pay that loan off on a monthly basis and buy a house, buy a car, or even perhaps eat, right? I'm being sarcastic, but there are times that people make choices that we enable that allow them to borrow very high amounts to go into jobs that are not likely to result in high pay. And that really is a problem. We also allow very high rates of borrowing for undergraduates. Now, if Chuck Grassley is right, or if he can get his bill passed, we will limit that in the future. And I think there's a good chance under the current administration that there will be a limit on undergraduate borrowing. That may be a good thing. The downside of that is that the neediest students will not be able to borrow to get through college, and that's highly concerning to me. But we know that popular opinion is pretty negative about student loan debt. We know that one view is that loan availability drives up college costs, the Bennett hypothesis. We know that another popular view is that loan amounts have gone up and up and up and created a bubble that puts the country at risk for an economic recession. The data really don't back that up, in spite of the fact that there is some merit to the arguments. One takeaway I hope you get from this course is that when we're talking about economic factors related to higher education, there's no simple answers. When we look at the Bennett hypothesis, it may be true in certain cases for elites, for for-profits, that more federal aid does drive up costs. But for most colleges and institutions, it's not the case. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. It doesn't appear that higher education debt is likely to lead to a recession. It is certainly creating hardships, and it is certainly problematic for certain categories of students or former students. And if we can fix those things, we would be, I argue, doing the right thing for society. But there are no simple answers to fix the problems, and it's certainly not, I would argue, mismanagement among higher education leaders, among faculty who are only working 6 months a year. In fact, the higher education enterprise is working pretty well. It's just gotten really expensive, and it's driving society to have to figure out alternatives. A first response, I think, is to criticize the entity that you don't like, in this case, a really high-priced college or university. So there are legitimate concerns to raise. The Bennett hypothesis has some legitimacy. The bubble hypothesis has some legitimacy and some comparability to the home mortgage bubble. In both cases, the situation's complicated, but we need to try to fix things. When we come back, we'll talk about how to try to reduce costs of higher education. I look forward to talking to you then.